Well, now we're sort of entering the second half of this biology course. We've learned about cells and how they're built up from smaller pieces. We have studied things like replication and cell division. Now it's time to look at what exactly life must do. And to do this, let's look back at what we talked about early in the course about the four essentials of life. Compare these four essentials to the things that might make something functional. Back when we learned about the essentials, we had a little activity where we thought about what were the essentials that made something an electronic device. We thought about all the things that you might find, let's say, on another planet that would point to something that is truly an electronic device. But now think about what must be added to that list that you had in order for the device to actually be working. What is it that makes that device working rather than just an electronic device that is broken? And how is that exercise we did about life in the blender kind of like a broken device? So that leads us into the main concepts for today, which is that life must overcome many challenges. You could list many challenges that life must overcome, but 8 of them that I like to think about are the following. Number 1, it needs to coordinate its various parts. So life has to coordinate, whether it's at the subcellular level, the different proteins talking to each other, interacting, or at the organismal level where the different organs talk to one another. There has to be coordination. There has to be timing and spatial coordination of all the parts. The second one is energy, which was one of the essentials and one of the preconditions. If life doesn't have energy, then of course it's just going to run out like a wind-up toy that's been wound up and then runs down and then stops. So there needs to be energy, and it has to overcome the hurdle of finding energy. Similarly, the third one, matter, was one of our preconditions. And life has to overcome the challenge of finding new matter, getting the kind of matter it needs, and processing that matter. The biosphere has no new matter, but each organism within the biosphere must find the matter that's in the biosphere and take it in and manage it and use it to grow. So that's the third of the things that it needs to overcome. The fourth thing that life needs to overcome is to deal with waste, which is the other end of receiving matter, is getting rid of it in the proper way. The fifth thing is sensing the environment. In order to properly coordinate its parts, it needs to receive signals not only from within the organism, but from without the organism, from outside. And it needs to find matter, locate it, find the energy, locate it, find mates in order to do sexual reproduction, and it needs to avoid dangers and toxins, just like we learned even bacteria can do this. Now, a normal life form needs to move. You might think that trees and plants don't need to move, but they have to find a way to move their roots through the ground to find new water to grow further. They need to move their seeds so that they're not just constantly growing in the very same exact spot. So movement is an important thing for all of life. The second to last thing it needs to do is to defend itself, not only against predators, but also against the heat, against the cold, against any kind of adverse environment it might face. And the final thing is reproduction. Unless an organism reproduces its own cells, it will eventually decay. The universe is always decaying. So it needs to reproduce its own cells, allow its own cells to go through division. And unless you're an organism that lives forever, you need to reproduce for the next generation. I recently found out, I'm not 100% sure if this has ever been proven, but lobsters don't die unless they run out of food or get eaten. So I guess if you were a lobster, you wouldn't really need to reproduce if you could just keep growing bigger, bigger, and bigger. But I'm not sure about that. Anyways, it's a fun thought to think about. Now, here's a story for you about a giant barrel-shaped protein. This is a protein called Chaperonin, and proteins often have funny names that end in "in," and this Chaperonin protein is there to help keep other proteins from being entangled in dangerous liaisons. So that's why they call it a chaperone. It actually is part of what's called the heat shock protein system, and that is defense against heat. So just as we talked about, one of the 8 things that cells have to overcome is to defend themselves, often against changes in the environment. And one way cells do this is through the heat shock protein. So this one particular chaperonin protein that's barrel-shaped is called GRO-EL. And it is shaped, as I mentioned, like a giant barrel. Of course, it's on the nanoscopic proportions. It has a lid that can open up, and it can let in the proteins that would otherwise get entangled inside of it to protect it from other proteins. So once it's inside safely, it actually massages the protein to get them back in shape and so that they can fold into the proper organization. Now, why is this so important when temperatures come up? Well, just imagine scrambled eggs. When you crack them onto the pan, they're liquidy, they're clear. That's proteins all nicely suspended in water, not actually touching each other. But as soon as the heat gets there, the proteins start to unfold, they start to glom onto each other, and it becomes a solid. So we don't want that happening inside of a living cell. And GRO-EL and the chaperone proteins and all the heat shock proteins are there to do that job. And they have to burn ATP to do their job because thermal energy is not enough to help massage the proteins back into their shape. So we're learning a lot about these things over and over again, and biology is just full of cycles upon cycles of learning. So you learn about ATP, you learn about molecular machines, you learn about keeping the cell healthy and undergoing what's called homeostasis, keeping everything stable. And then you find out that what you learned before is what you now need in order to understand the next part of biology. Now, if you're going to go a little deeper, there's a few more roots and branches you might want to look at. The root of structure, growth, homeostasis, and reproduction would be a good root to dive into, and the branch of how do organisms maintain homeostasis.